Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof Media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I am your host, Constant Reader Scott Daly, and I'm joined, as always, by the first alternate of this podcast and The Walk, Mr. Matt Freeman. How's it going today, Matt?
Oh, it's going pretty well. I did really well on those tests, all those psychological tests and essays. Got a minor cold here, as you can hear, but I don't think that'll interfere with my progress on this 200-mile walk.
No, you'll be fine, man. You'll be fine. It just means you have to just work a little bit harder. That's all.
Yeah. You know, I heard that vitamin C is good for you. If you're sick.
I've also heard that. So just take some of that.
Yeah, that's the plan.
This week on the show, our coverage of Richard Bachman's The Long Walk continues with our fourth episode. This week we'll be covering chapters 10 through 13 of the novel. It's our penultimate episode, Matt. The next chapters will be the end of the book, so we're getting there. I don't know. I guess, does it feel like the book's almost over to you?
Well, that's a really interesting question because it is a very structurally strange book. So in one sense, no. But that, like, the book has had no clear structural demarcations of any kind.
Sure.
You know, it would be very difficult for me to go through and say where the act breaks are. I'm sure you could argue that it has some. But I would be hard pressed to find them, or at least to argue that they're clear cut. And I think that's kind of just the idea behind this book, is that it is just this merciless plodding marathon toward the finish line where there's not necessarily going to be any particular moment of catharsis. You know, we only have 1 week left, and I'm starting to think like this this cathartic realization that I've been wanting Garrity to have. I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't think that's the kind of book this is, actually. I think it kind of just keeps going on the way it is, and then somebody survives, and the book ends. but we'll see.
Yeah, we will see. We got to get through this week's chapters first, and then we'll be there. And that actually, Matt, brings us into our quick announcement before we start this week's episode. We will not be having a show next week. We are going to be taking off. You, Mr. Matt, are going to be traveling internationally, which you picked a great time to get sick, by the way. Just well done.
Yeah, no, I definitely planned this. Yeah.
I think we were originally hoping to find some way of having time to record both episodes prior to you leaving the country. That didn't happen for a variety of reasons, one of which being that was a stupid plan to begin with, that we never would have been able to pull off. But that is why we're only letting you folks know about it right now. It's just we kind of kept that in our back pocket, hoping that we would find some way to have enough time to where we could get together twice in 1 week to record these episodes, and it just didn't happen. So we'll be taking next week off. I'm not sure. We might either like pull an episode from Other Levels of the Tower to play on next Thursday, or I might find some other idea to sit down and do some bonus episode or something. But we'll have something for you next week. But unfortunately, right here on the cusp of the end of the long walk, we're going to have to take 1 quick week off. So we're sorry about that, but we'll be back really quickly after that.
Yes, it feels somehow appropriate to this book to just keep the pace. Just
stretch it out.
Stretch it out. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. Let's get into it, Matt. Let's talk about these chapters of The Long Walk. We begin with chapter 10. And if you don't believe it, this chapter begins with more walking.
Oh.
It is 8 p.m. on the second day of the walk when the rain that we talked about last week finally lets up and the walkers are forced to go on, cold and miserable. We see that Garrity is walking by himself. Everyone's kind of separated from each other. They're not clumped right now because everyone's freezing and miserable. And we get this part here that I wanted to kind of introduce, I think, maybe one of the themes of this week. It says, he had dropped back and was almost to the tail of the column and reluctantly realized he was angling towards Stebbins again. Something about Stebbins fascinated him, but he decided he didn't particularly care what that something was. It was time to give up wondering about things. There was no percentage in it. It was just another royal pisser.
That's the spirit.
Kind of, yeah. it's our ever introspective, thinking, pondering Garrity has kind of just given up on doing any of that.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that it would have been kind of worn out of him by this point
Yeah.
in time.
And it's also, I mean, it's also not exactly true, right? Because Garrity will continue to think about things and ponder and wonder throughout this chapter, but like we meet him at a time right here at the beginning of this chapter where he's in a shit mood, he's cold, he's wet, and he's just like, fuck this, I don't want to think about why I'm so interested in this guy anymore.
Yeah, right. Just an absurd level of sleep deprivation, etc. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think it. I think Doylistically, like the thing that we're doing with the idea of Garrity continually thinking to himself, like, what's the point of even asking these questions? Like what's the point of thinking about tomorrow? Like even from pretty early in the book, he had this attitude of like, the moment I'm trying to remember the details of is the moment when he talks about like money not being important. And it's like it's this attitude that he's had. This is very like short term attitude, like almost an intentionally myopic philosophy of life. Like just do what's in front of you. Don't think about the future.
Sure.
And this is kind of in contrast to a lot of the other boys who have these different philosophical attitudes toward life and the future and death and all these things. So I think that's this is kind of a consistent through line for his character.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting too, because one of the great mysteries of the book, if we can even call it that, is why is Raymond Garrity here, right? That is the one thing that he has not adequately been able to answer himself. It's the one thing that people have asked him multiple times. We've gotten some answers. You know, McVrees has said, "Oh, we're all here to die. You're here because you wanted to die," but we haven't really gotten a confident, like definitive answer on that. And perhaps one of the reasons why we haven't got a definitive answer on that is because every time Ray starts like thinking or wondering, he kind of says, I'm sick of this shit, I don't care, and he moves on. And so that is the one thing that's kind of pulling us through the novel.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
So Garrity is thinking about how Old Town is only 16 miles away, and once they get there, he knows the route, he knows where they are, and he will walk in familiar roads for the rest of the walk, or at least this portion of the walk. Who knows how long it'll go for?
Sure.
And in the middle of him thinking that, Stebbins talks to him and says, "Maybe it's your edge. I don't think so, but maybe it is." Garrity jumped. It was as if Stebbins had pried the lid off his mind and peeked down inside. So I just thought it'd be fun to maybe like pretend here and have some fun with the idea that Stebbins perhaps has the touch. Matt, what do you think?
That's a really interesting thought. I agree. It'll be fun to talk about, even though the thought didn't occur to me at all at the time. I think within the frame of this story, Stebbins is just like the most perfectly attuned person to the idea of the walk, to the philosophical underpinnings of the walk, and also he's kind of been doing these psychological cold reads on all the other players down to the level of knowing what they're thinking and so forth. And I think, you know, the irony is going to be that it's still not going to save him, regardless of the fact that he, you know, understands everything better than everyone else. It's not going to save him. It is fun to imagine, though, that like characters in this story might have the touch. That's a fun idea. I don't know. Do you
I mean,
think he does?
I thought it was a fun thought experiment. I don't think that's actually what's happening here. I think it's more along the lines of what you're saying. I think another fun interpretation is literally just Garrity is so zonked and cold that he's actually just speaking out loud to himself and doesn't realize it.
Yeah, that thought occurred to me also. That's fun. Yeah, it's interesting. I wondered how literally to take Stebbins here. What I mean by that is like, do you think when they assemble their 100 to 200 selectees, do you think that the selection committee is sort of trying to get this might make just as much sense to talk about later when we're going to talk about the selection process, but since that's on my mind right now, like, are they trying to find a variety of boys with a variety of different strengths like you could view this as a sort of Darwinian exercise
Sure.
of like what are the best, strongest qualities, and then
Hmm.
you pick a boy that represents, you know, X. You pick a boy that represents uh, uh, this other thing, and then you pit them against each other, and you see what the strongest what the strongest element is. I don't really
Yeah.
think this is why they're doing it, honestly, but this is another thought that occurred to me.
No, I mean, this is a fun thing to think about, and I think it's one consequence of King's choice to hide a lot of the world building from us is that we really don't know, like from a state perspective, what the goal of this thing is, right? Like, obviously, it's become this huge national pastime that people are into. It's the kind of the greatest sport of this world, we're led to believe. But yeah, like we don't know, other than distraction and entertainment, like what is the end goal of this. And I think which people are being picked uh could, perhaps give us a window into what that goal is, but we just don't know.
Yeah, it's something I haven't been thinking about much until this week. But like, what do all these boys have in common? You know,
Hmm.
and I don't know that I have an answer to that. It's just clearly they were selected.
Yeah.
It's not random at all, and it's not even just a matter of,
No, Matt,
oh,
it's
these are
totally
the.
random. It's totally random.
It's not like it's just like these are the. Oh wait, do you really think it's random?
No, I don't. I
No, no,
think
no.
I
Yeah.
think the book says it's random, that their like names are kind of drawn out of a hat once they've qualified, but I
Oh,
don't think it's
oh, oh, yeah.
random.
Once they've qualified, yeah. No, but yes, I don't believe it's random either. It's funny that we
Mhm.
both agreed on that without even talking about it beforehand.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, it seems very much like there's a um there's an intent behind it. I guess it could be random. Like it's funny. What one comment that I had while walking away from this week's reading was like everything about the long walk is actually meticulously above board. Like everything is exactly the way they say it is, precisely. You know,
Yeah,
like
maybe.
everything we've seen. You know,
Sure. I mean, we've seen no reason to doubt that, but I mean,
yeah,
I think that's an interesting conversation when we get to that part
sure,
of the
sure.
text, that I want to highlight some stuff there that might contradict that, but I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think I am jumping ahead. So let's just get back on track. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. So Stebbins and Garrity chat here, and every time Stebbins and Garrity chat, we have a deep philosophical discussion about life and survival and death and all these things. And Stebbins offers a metaphor here that I wanted to kind of dissect with you. He says, "It's amazing how the mind operates the body. It's amazing how it can take over and dictate to the body. Your average housewife may walk up to 16 miles a day, from icebox to ironing board to clothesline. She's ready to put her feet up at the end of the day, but she's not exhausted. A door-to-door salesman might do 20. A high school kid in training for football walks 25 to 28. That's one day from getting up in the morning to going to bed at night. All of them get tired, but none of them get exhausted. Yeah, but suppose you told the housewife, 'Today you must walk 16 miles before you can have your supper.' Garrity nodded. She'd be exhausted instead of tired. Stebbins said nothing. Garrity had that perverse feeling that Stebbins was disappointed in him. Well, wouldn't she? Don't you think she'd have her 16 miles by noon so she could kick off her shoes and spend the afternoon watching soaps? And then he goes on to say, a mule doesn't like to plow, but he likes carrots. So you hang a carrot in front of his eyes. A mule without a carrot gets exhausted. A mule with a carrot spends a long time being tired. So this is really interesting to me, Matt, because I think we get what Stebbins is saying here, right? The mule and the carrot part of the metaphor is pretty clear. But I think the housewife exhaustion portion of this thing is a little confused, and that's, I mean, that's the reason why Garrity doesn't really get it, right? Garrity answers the question exactly wrong from Stebbins' mind, but I think he answers the question exactly right from the way Garrity had formulated the metaphor, right? He builds the scenario and says, but suppose you do this. And Garrity says, oh yeah, it would be different. It would be the other thing you're talking about. And he's like, no, it would be the same. And you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
So talk to me about this. What do you think about this housewife metaphor?
Well, it's funny because I don't think I agree with Stebbins necessarily. Like I think I agree more with Garrity. I guess like the idea that um, if you if I just if I'm just going about my day, I don't have any idea how many steps I'm walking. But if you tell
Yeah.
me in advance, like, oh, you've got to walk 16 miles today, I'd be like, oh my God, like I would turn it into this enormous burden that I was going to have to carry.
Hmm.
Whereas I would have just done it uncomplainingly in the first place, right?
Hmm.
So like that's one interesting psychological fact in and of itself. Now, it may be true that if I knew I had to walk 16 miles, I might walk it really quickly to get it over with, but that that would be a different you don't necessarily have the option of doing that is maybe one way to frame it. Like
Yeah.
the long walk, for example, they can't get the long walk done faster by walking twice as fast.
Yeah.
That's not how it works at all. It's literally just how long can you be exhausted, you could say.
Yeah, and it's great because I do agree. Like one of the things that this book is most dealing with is the idea of what is motivating these people to keep going, right? Like, what is it? What is it that, and all the kids are kind of asking themselves and each other these questions of like, what is it that keeps a person going when everything else says they should have stopped? What is it in the mind that allows a person to push through that stuff? So, I mean, Stebbins talking about the idea of a carrot here, and when you have something, some goal you're reaching for, you can use that. Garrity talking about getting to Freeport and getting to see his girl and his mom, is one of his carrots that's pushing him forward. I like all this. I think it's just that the housewife part of it confuses it more than necessary, because I agree with you. Like when I was reading this for the first time and on this reread, I went where Garrity was doing. I see, yeah, of course. Like, tell a person how many miles they have to walk before they're allowed to rest. They'll be a lot more tired than if they just walked those without knowing it. That makes logical sense, right? And then that's not all there. So I guess the question is this a badly constructed metaphor because King constructed a bad metaphor? Or is it a badly constructed metaphor because it's supposed to indicate something interesting about Stebbins as a character?
Well, I think Stebbins in particular has a particular worldview,
Mm-hmm.
much like all the other characters. But I think Stebbins has been highlighted consistently as a very unique kid. He's probably
Yeah.
like, wise beyond his years. He talks differently than everybody else. He has this very precise, complete sentences way of speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Uses colons. um, but I think he's still capable of being wrong, and I think he probably is wrong about some important things. Like, I mean, just for example, like the idea that it's the carrot that's driving them. I don't think that's true at all.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think these boys are being driven by the thought of the prize. I think they're being driven by the whip, by the thought of being shot. Maybe what got them to sign up for the long walk was the carrot because they're stupid. But now, surely it's just the idea that they don't want to be shot that's keeping them going. That's
Yeah. Yeah.
Every once in a while, one of them will talk about the prize, but that's not what's keeping their feet moving, right?
Yeah. I like what you're saying here, because in Stebbins' mule metaphor, the one thing he doesn't talk about is the whip, right? It is, are you pulled along by your need, or are you pushed along by a threat of danger?
Yeah,
And the walk, certainly certainly people following you the entire time with guns to your head is more the former, or the latter than the former, right?
yeah,
And yet it is still interesting to talk about. I think I think you're absolutely right that Stebbins went into this thing with a supernatural level of confidence. I say supernatural, I don't actually mean he's magical, Matt.
yeah.
We just talked about that we didn't think he was, but he is supremely confident in his understanding of how to win this thing, of what it takes mentally, what it takes physically, of understanding the rules of the game and how to manipulate them, or at least just by knowing and understanding and having this knowledge, it gets you a leg up. He has, as you said, he has a worldview, and he's very confident in his worldview. And I do think, in my opinion, this metaphor being a little sketchy is King starting to gesture towards the fact that, hey, maybe this guy doesn't actually know what he's talking about. And we're going to see another example of that later this week as well. That is another kind of chink in the armor that is Stebbins' supreme confidence in himself.
I mean, I think you can almost already dismiss Stebbins' attitude with a very simple observation, which is that relatively few of the boys have died due to what you might call exhaustion, at least in the sense that Stebbins is indicating. Like, some of them have cracked mentally. Some of them have had cramps where they couldn't physically move their legs. None of them have just said, "Oh gosh, I'm beat," and sat down and waited to be shot. Like, that's just not a thing that's happened. Interesting thought experiment is like, how would the long walk look if, when you drop below, okay, let's say same exact rules, everything is the same, except instead, when you get your ticket, instead of shooting you, they just literally hand you a ticket, say you're out, and you're done. How different is it, right? How
I think it's a lot shorter, right?
It's probably a lot shorter. Probably a lot more boys drop out really quickly. Maybe there are a few, psychos who are willing to go, who are actually willing to walk for two days without sleeping, because we know from reality that real people will do that.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I think it'll be a lot shorter generally.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was thinking about the reality television show Survivor a lot this week, because I think when we were talking, we're jumping ahead now, but there's a bit later in the book where Garrity is saying, like, oh, tonight everyone, like, a bunch of people are going to drop out, and one of the other kids is like, I think it's Parker, is like, no, this is like, he builds like a cracker metaphor, right, where all the crumbs fell first and then the slightly bigger pieces, and now the only thing that's left are the big crackers that are going to be sticking around for a long time. And there is an interesting thing in competitions like this, like if you watch the Mr. Beast challenges that extend a ridiculous amount of time, or you watch Survivor where they have these challenges that are just kind of ridiculous things that are sometimes just feats of patience and long-term strength. Like, you do have this phenomenon where a lot of people drop out early, and then what usually happens is the last few people just hang on forever, like just like it just becomes this absurd challenge between the last few people, and so I think there is something true to that cracker metaphor there, and it does make you question this idea of, like, how many people would the prize be enough of a motivation for to push them beyond any reasonable level. Like, I think you're totally right that the walk would be shorter in general if there was no death attached to it. But I do think that carrot would push a lot of people for a very long time. Maybe not as many people. Maybe at this point in the walk there's 10 instead of 40 or whatever our number is at now. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, right. I think it's fascinating, right? It's a fascinating case study, because it's not, it's not just we shoot you if you slow down, and it's not just we reward you if you last the longest. It's both at the same time. So it's like, you could argue that the person who is most likely to win is the one who is susceptible to the prize and also afraid of dying. However, I think this is overly philosophical, because you can still just get a cramp in your leg and not be able to walk and get shot, and it doesn't matter what your mindset was.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Stebbins is operating from this perspective of I've cracked the code, and yet maybe one of the true fundamental answers here is that there is no easy code to crack. It's just a lot of luck sometimes.
Right.
But I mean, I still think there is some truth to the fact that, eventually it gets down to the last couple people, and I don't know, that there's something, and maybe the end of the book will answer this for us, but there's something driving a person to keep going when every other logical factor says that there's no way you should have been able to do that anymore.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I that is one element of the story that I think is fascinating, is the idea that, both suffering and perseverance are largely mental phenomena. Obviously there's physical components, but your ability to handle suffering is very much in the mind. Different characters handle it to different degrees. Yeah.
So speaking of how different characters are handling it, Garrity leaves Stebbins behind, and Stebbins left him with a little thing, what he'll later say is a joke, but say that Stebbins has, or that Olsen has some knowledge, or cracked something, or understands something that none of the other boys understand yet. And that kind of pressures Garrity into walking over towards Olsen and trying to talk to him and see if he'll respond. And by the way, the text describes Olsen at this point as a shambling haunted house on legs, which is just absolutely horrifying. Like the descriptions of what Olsen must look like at this point, just, oh man, rough.
Yeah, it's amazing. I love it.
So Garrity attempts to talk to him, and at one point, as they're walking towards Old Town, Olsen comes to himself just enough to speak, and he says God's garden is full of weeds. He says here. So I don't know. Have you heard this? This is a parable that Jesus told at one point. I don't know if you recall this one in your copious Catholicism studies.
I don't remember the moral of the story here. Do you know?
So the basic parable, I think, was this idea that like your existence on Earth is a garden, and you plant your seeds in the garden, and then some force comes through and sneaks in the middle of the night and plants a bunch of weeds in the garden as well. And you can't rip the weeds out without damaging the rest of the crops. And so basically what must be done is you must let both crop and weed grow in full at the same time, and then only at the end can you harvest the crop and then harvest the weed and get it out of there. And that it's supposed to be a metaphor about heaven, right? Is that like on earth there is righteous, good, holy people, and there is evil, and these things grow together simultaneously, and we can't remove them. We can't remove one without removing the other. But in death, there are two different places you can go, right? There's heaven and there's hell. And so it basically saying, don't worry, folks, there's evil everywhere, but in heaven you will be cut away from the weed and find your righteous place in heaven. That's the parable. And so I'm not even 100% sure if this is what Olsen is gesturing towards, but I kind of think so, right? I don't know.
Yeah, well, as you were going through that, I was thinking about kind of the sort of Darwinian framing I suggested earlier, and like the idea that there are, amongst the walkers, there are both the righteous and the unrighteous, and the idea that like the purpose of the walk is to select that one ultimate Ubermensch, the boy who's just better than all the other boys, who will get to ascend to his prize, which is in this case a earthly prize. But I think it does line up fairly well. That's really interesting. Yeah.
I like that. I mean, it is kind of really fascinating that Olsen has become like our de facto religious metaphor character, right? Which I don't think when we met Olsen at the beginning of the book, like he really indicated that. But like for the last few chapters, every time we've referenced Olsen, he's been talking about something related to God. And he says it again here, right? Like he says to Garrity that Jesus will save you.
Yeah.
Right before he decides to die, that's the last thing he says to Garrity. So he's kind of been the de facto spiritual imagery character for a while now.
It's funny, we did just agree that Stebbins is not supernatural in any way, but Olsen almost seems to be serving as a kind of visionary character here,
sure,
a kind of prophet, you could say. I mean, I think he is serving as a prophet in the literary sense, if not actually receiving visions from God, textually, because he's channeling these, religious ideas, and then he sort of takes this stand against their oppressors in a way where he is able to do things that seem supernatural, actually.
Yeah, I mean, he gets shot how many times and keeps getting up and walking, right?
And a ridiculous number of times, yes.
Yeah. So that's what happened next. Olsen says that Jesus will save Garrity, starts walking directly towards the half track. I love the statement, there was a ruinous dignity about him. I love that sentence so much.
Yeah,
so Olsen climbs up and manages to rip away one of the guns from the soldiers, but the others shoot him right in the gut. We're told later by Stebbins that these gut shots are intentional, that they're to discourage others from doing what Olsen did here. Either way, he dies, Matt, and he dies really freaking hard. The last thing he says before he dies, though, is he screams, "I did it wrong." Did what, Matt? What do you think he's talking about here?
I really don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This one question I have about this book is: Am I supposed to be able to puzzle out what Olson means here? Am I just slow, or is it meant to be somewhat opaque? Because I really don't. I mean, does he mean that his his life has been a mistake? Does he mean that just this last act of his has been a mistake? Um, I don't know.
Yeah.
One thing I'll say about the whole scene there is it's like much like a lot of the stuff we're going to see in this week's reading, Olson's charge of the Light Brigade that he undertakes against the half track is somehow totally inspiring and badass while being totally doomed and pointless and meaningless.
Yeah.
It's like both at the same time. And I think the book at this point is playing with the idea that something can be both of those things at the same time.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that a bit more later on, I think.
Yeah, no, I think I like that. I like that a lot. And yeah, I mean, as to answer your original question, I don't think you're supposed to know definitively. And I think we should start priming ourselves for a reality in which this book is not going to necessarily offer clear, definitive answers to anything. And I think that's in line with Stephen King, right? Like, I think he it's not that he's incredibly opaque all the time. I think sometimes he's very, very clear about what he's doing, but I also think he doesn't like to answer questions definitively. And you could say this about the Dark Tower, right? Like, what is Roland's ultimate lesson, right? Well,
Yeah.
you could have an interpretation, but your interpretation might be different than mine. It's not necessarily clear, what the tower wants Roland to do. I mean, we could gesture at, oh, well, he wants them to not sacrifice the people he loves. He wants him to lose focus on his addiction and focus on the things around him. And these things seem clear by the book, but like, I don't know, there's imagery throughout those books that doesn't offer you something clear and definitive. And I agree with you. There's nothing in the book that, at least so far, that could give us any hint about what Olson means here. And I like to think, the boring answer to me is the walk. Like, I messed up the walk.
Uh-huh.
I like to be more grandiose and larger and he's talking about his life, my life. This was my chance. This is all I got, and I did it wrong. Whatever I did to end up here, I did it wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely felt like whatever he's saying here, he's not just saying like, tactically speaking, it was a bad idea to bum rush the half track. I think he's making a larger statement about his choices and how he has used his life upon this earth.
Yeah.
Especially since he's, contextualizing everything in this religious framework where it's like what you do with your time on this earth and how you spend your life is of profound meaning, actually.
Yeah. I also like it as a little bit of a crucified Jesus moment where, Jesus says, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do." Well, Olson Christ says, I did it wrong. I messed up. I know not what I did. Yeah.
It's like taking responsibility for it instead of blaming the soldiers, you could say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So Garrity links up with McVrees again, who says that the worst thing about this whole thing is that it's all so trivial. And I was curious if you agree with our friend Pete McVrees on this one, Matt. Do you agree that the worst part of this thing is that it's trivial, it's meaningless?
Well, this is like exactly what I wanted to talk about. So It just so happens that like I've had a lot of conversations this week about meaning with various people. And ultimately, I think the truth is that whether or not it's trivial, whether or not it has meaning, is all a matter of perspective. It's all subjective. There's no true answer. McVrees is allowed to think that it's trivial. From his perspective, It is trivial. He's the sort of character who is predisposed toward thinking it's trivial because he had this relationship that meant everything to him, and then it just kind of disappeared like smoke, and was sort of, in a sense, revealed to have been nothing all along. but that doesn't mean that everything is trivial, that everything is meaningless. You can look at what Olsen did, and you can call it the pinnacle of a meaningless gesture to charge the half tracks, right? It's like that you knew how that was going to end.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like, he did kind of put some dirt in their eye. He managed to pull one of the guns away for a second. He kind of showed that they're not gods for a moment. And if again we take this to the metaphor of the walk as a metaphor for life, if you're limited to only making gestures that are futile, then is it really meaningless if you still take the effort to make those gestures rather than just sitting down and getting shot?
Yeah, I like this. I think there is a lot to be said about, what is meaningless, what is trivial, and what isn't. And I do think that the book is trying to grapple with this idea because you're right. In life, when you're living under what is increasingly becoming apparent is like a totalitarian regime that they live under, what meaningful change can one do? What power does the individual actually have to institute or force or protest the desire for change in this world? And there doesn't seem to be like one. I think a great counter to what we're talking about here is the raspberry salute that our characters are going to make here in the next chapter that is ineffectual and pointless and immediately like disappointing to all those involved. But this idea of if you can make a point, if you can change someone's mind, if you can inspire someone else, like what is and isn't trivial. And obviously the state thinks that the walk is not trivial, right? Like we don't know what it is, but there is a reason that they support this thing and continue to push this thing and have made it one of the center things of the culture in this world.
Yeah.
They see it as important and key to how they maintain control, one could assume. So yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, that I like that. I think there's a lot of people, including me, in certain moments, who sort of fantasize about like what I would do if I were in a totalitarian state.
Yeah.
And it's always, the fantasy is always like, I would stand against the evil.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, what that really looks like in real life is, you don't salute along with the crowd. And then later they come to your house and they put a bag over your head and nobody ever hears from you again.
Yeah.
Like, it's not you don't actually get like a cool, grandiose moment, and you don't ever get to learn whether or not that mattered or whether it was even noticed by anyone. And yet, does that make it meaningless also? Like at the same time, I want to say, I'm not saying it's pointless to stand up against tyranny, because it's not. It's just that it's actually not glamorous.
Yeah.
And it can and it looks very trivial, and it looks meaningless, and maybe it feels meaningless. I don't want to say that it is meaningless,
Yeah. No, I get that. I love this so much because there's no easy answer here. And I agree with you. This idea that it's certainly glamorous to think about what type of person you would be in that society. I tend to be pessimistic enough to be, I would just be a total lackey of the state and wouldn't even know it. Like, it's like the old thing of like, you want to believe like, I'm going to go back to slavery time America, and I will be one of the people speaking out against this because I will know better. And it's like, yeah, sure. I would love to believe that, but I don't know. There were millions of people that were just completely indoctrinated by that system and didn't see any problem with it whatsoever. Right. Yeah. So it's fun to put yourself in those scenarios, but yeah, it's never quite as cut and dry as you think it is. And yeah, I mean, I want to believe that actions have like, not only do actions have consequences, but actions have meaning, that the things we do, the things we say, the choices we make mean something in a world, even if it's a world in which we have no control whatsoever. So that's what I want to believe, and I think that's one of the things that this book is examining. So we'll see. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, just one last note on this is like what happened to Garrity's father is a perfect example of what we're talking about, because
Mm-hmm.
his being squatted was not some triumphant, act of he wasn't exactly Cassian Andor, right? He was
Yeah.
just some guy who ran his mouth off, and they got him, and that was it. That's the end of his story.
Yeah.
I mean, if there is an impact, the impact will be through his son, but I don't think that his son is taking the right lesson to heart, if you know what I mean.
Well,
So
this is a good question, Matt. At this point in the book, you've read almost all of it. You've got 4 more chapters to go. Do you think this is a book that ends with a dismantling of the system? That this is the last long walk?
I don't see any reason to believe that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it does make you wonder, like, if you really get your heart's desire, if you win the long walk, if you were to win the walk and say, like, bring it all down, turn the system upside down. I want everything to, they're, like, they're not really going to grant that, are they? That's like, let's be realistic, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it's possible. Like
Sure.
this could be like this could be the referendum on the society, right? You could say, if one of these kids 1 year says that we need to change the way we do things, then we will, because this kid has been selected. This kid is the best of us by our selection criteria of finding the best kid in America, or whatever this country is called. He's the best of us. So he gets to tell us what to do. Like, maybe they believe that. I don't know. We haven't seen any real indication that that's true. So I would lean away from that.
Yeah, nothing for me. I was curious where your head was at this point. So our chapter ends with Garrity deciding to doze while walking, and one of the things he's thinking to himself as he sleeps is, "Daddy, I wasn't glad when you had to go, but I never really missed you when you were gone. Sorry, but that's not the reason I'm here. I have no subconscious urge to kill myself. Sorry, Stebbins. So sorry, but..." and then he's interrupted by someone getting shot. But I don't know. What did you think of this? Do you think Garrity's right in this analysis of himself? That he's not here because his dad? That he's not here because he wants to kill himself? What do you think?
Well, he keeps insisting that it's the case. And like I said earlier, I see no real sign that he's going to suddenly hit upon a cathartic, Freudian realization of what's really going on. So I don't know. I know that you have future knowledge, but I at this point in the book, what did you think?
Gosh, I can't remember that. There's no way.
Okay.
There's no way I could answer that without bringing
sure.
in
Okay.
some knowledge with it.
Fair enough. It's just it's tricky. It's because I want to say, I think at this point I'll just say I'm increasingly tempted to just take him at his word.
Yeah.
But that leaves me to wonder, like, well, then why the hell are you here? Like those are the typical narrative answers why a person like you would be in a situation like this. So if those aren't the answers, then like, what is it?
No, that's true.
Yeah.
I don't know. Well, maybe we'll find out. Maybe we won't.
Yep.
All right, so we move on to chapter 11. The first major event of this chapter is the 400 gun salute the boys are given as they enter the turnpike on-ramp. Just for the record, it's kind of fucked up, right? These kids have been listening to gunshots for the past 2.5 days now, and they've been getting murdered one by one, and you think, hey, this is a great way to celebrate you, is firing a bunch of guns in your general direction.
Yeah, the major has an amazing sense of humor.
We talked about this already, but I really do love this part where the boys decide to blow some raspberries in response to this salute. And the way the text describes this is so heartbreaking. It was pitiful, really. A little pitiful noise of defiance in the big dark. It was not repeated. The wooden faces of their color guard did not change, but seemed all the same to indicate a subtle reproach. And I think this goes right back to what we were talking about before, right? This idea of, did this matter? Did, like, a pitiful little noise of defiance in the big dark, is that something that matters? Is it does something not become trivial only if it has effect? Or, like, just because you do it, I think therefore I
Yeah.
am. I exist and I did something, and it doesn't matter if it has no effect on anyone. It matters because I did it. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. This is like the theme of this week. I think is exploring the idea of apparently meaningless gestures of defiance in the face of an uncaring universe, in the face of the inexorability of death. Um, is it really meaningless just because you can see no effect of it? I love what you just said. Like, just because there's no effect, or there's no effect that you can see, does that mean that you should despair and that you
Yeah.
should think it's meaningless?
Yeah. We know that Pete does. I think this is really in line with this character, that like he I think in his mind's eye, because he was the one that came up with this, saw this as being something loud and boisterous and defiant of the 40 some odd boys left in this thing, countering this horrible salute, and like maybe not having a direct effect, but at least being affecting.
Yeah,
And he's immediately disappointed in the effect of it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's you can see why they've never done an adaptation of this book.
Right?
It's so like unrelentingly unsentimental. Like, think
Yeah.
about how disappointing this moment would be in a.
Yeah. Oh my
Yeah, I
gosh.
mean,
Yeah.
just on the page, but also like on the screen.
Hmm.
Like you'd be like building up toward it, and then it just falls totally flat, and you're just like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
okay,
Man. So Garrity kind of drifts off again and resumes thinking about his past. And here it says he thought of Jimmy Owens. He had hit Jimmy with the barrel of his air rifle, and yes, he had meant to, because it had been Jimmy's idea. Taking off their clothes and touching each other had been Jimmy's idea. It had been Jimmy's idea. So this is really interesting, right? This was kind of in the Jack Torrance way. Garrity told the story about this kid he hit with an air rifle, and in the original version of the story was insistent that it was just an accident, although it left some doubts as to the truth of that. And then here, a little bit later, he's admitting that no, that yes, I did hit this kid on purpose. It was totally on purpose, and it was for this very specific reason, which is that they're, I think the conversation was about, what girls look like down there, and but this is more specific to Jimmy wanted them to take off each other's clothes and touch each other.
yeah,
Which is, there's been a lot of kind of, I mean, this book's obviously talking a lot about masculinity and traditional, male ness. And there has been a fair amount of homophobia mixed in here as well. Like, there's a part here we didn't talk about at the time, where the two guys at the Vanguard, who we learn this week are actually just brothers, two brothers here together, were just assumed by the rest of the kids as being gay, and like they were the kind of ostracized because of that, or the rest of the kids are made uncomfortable. And there is a lot of like, I think this feels to me, King exploring like a very, especially at the time, realistic portrayal of young boys, and like this absolute terror of the possibility of homosexuality, right?
yeah,
Just like a thing that, like, I think probably not as extreme in the 70s, but I remember in the 90s, like this is things that we talked about. Young boys in the 90s talked about, oh man, I'm glad I'm not gay.
yeah.
Definitely, like, that kind of stuff.
Well, yeah. I mean, I talk glowingly about Boy Scouts a lot, but the amount of just like casual homophobia in Boy Scouts was pretty
Sure. Yeah.
intense, actually.
Yeah.
It was so pervasive as to be, even in retrospect, kind of weird.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's part and parcel with the recurring themes of sexual confusion and frustration that have pervaded the book, where homophobia ends up just being another representation of, or another manifestation rather, of like sexuality being a source of confusion and shame,
Sure.
while also being alluring and mysterious, and the most important thing in the world. You're not supposed to talk about it, and just like, yeah, it's just this kind of this extremely confusing thing for young people, understandably.
Yeah. I mean, it is really interesting because, young Garrity, this is were they like 8 years old in this memory? I think something around there. His reaction to this thing was so immediately violent, like that the shame drove him to violence, which is really interesting that he felt that immediate kind of shame comes from somewhere, that he felt that he needed to lash out violently against this kid.
Yeah.
I don't know. It is really interesting. We have to pay attention to this and follow it and see if it pops up again. But I think you're right. Like, sexuality is playing such a huge role, and I think it fits. They're young boys, right? They're 16, well, actually 14 to 18-year-old boys. Turns out sexuality is a great important part of the lives of these kids, shockingly.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, but just
pubescent young men, huh? Who knew?
Yeah. I think I do think it's kind of interesting to view this as a continuation of the continuing idea that sexuality is a source of simultaneous like fascination and shame, because that's been pretty consistent for the whole book, actually.
Yeah, I like that. So it turns out these two guys, the two at the front of the vanguard, are not gay. They're brothers, and their names are Joe and Mike. And they're how do you pronounce this Native American tribe?
I think it's Hopis.
Hopis. Yeah, it's a Native American tribe from Arizona. What I find really interesting here, Matt, is I'm particularly fascinated by McVree's response to hearing that they're brothers on the walk together. I think what he says is that their parents deserve to be squatted for allowing two brothers to sign up for the walk at the same time. And that's really interesting. What I guess, what was your interpretation of why Pete felt so strongly about this in particular?
I guess I figured if you put two of your sons into the walk, then you know that at most one of them will survive, meaning one of them will die, which is kind of bad. But this isn't explicit, but I kind of read into this that there was some kind of political statement being made here, by potentially something having to do with this Native American tribe and the way they're being treated, and so they. But I don't know. I mean, allegedly, it's all random, right? So
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that is interesting. I think we've seen like bits and pieces of, again, this is a consequence of King's world building, is how pervasive is racism in this society. Does it still exist? I think we've seen bits and pieces of it, but really nothing definitive. So I don't know, but I agree with you that it is kind of interesting that I'm trying to think of how to phrase this, that we make special attention to the fact that they're Native American, right? That they're like, so it seems like we are trying to do something there.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, again, it's like I'm having to read between the lines to even guess that there's a political motive, because it doesn't say that there is, it doesn't say that there is at all, actually. So maybe it just seems like it would make sense if that were the case.
Yeah. All right. So as we wrap up this chapter, there's one more quote I wanted to talk to you about here. It says, Garrity dozed on fitfully, and the visions in his head were alternatively of love and horror. In one of the dreams, a low droning voice asked over and over again, "Are you experienced? Are you experienced? Are you experienced?" And he could not tell if the voice was the voice of Stebbins or of the Major. So what do you think about this, Matt?
Well, that's great. I mean, it's obviously another sexual idea hovering around in his brain. Just to let everyone know how uncultured I am, I had to be like, Scott, I know this is a reference to something. I know this is from like a song, but I don't remember what song. And Scott was like, Matt, it's Jimi Hendrix. And I was like, okay.
It's the name of a song, and I believe his first album, is his debut album, was titled "Are You Experienced?"
Yeah. So I knew it was something like that.
Yeah, you got it. You got it.
Partial credit.
What do you think about the idea that he's not sure if the voice is Stebbins or the Major, though?
I don't know.
Why those two people?
Yeah, I mean, are they two opposite poles of a certain concept for him? Because if so, I don't really quite see it. I don't see how Stebbins and the Major are ideologically opposed or whatever. I don't know. I don't really get it. Do you?
Um, no, I mean, I do think like Stebbins has become like a philosophical idea in Garrity's head. And the Major is, I guess, kind of our representation of the walk itself. So I guess that makes sense when you think about it, but no,
Yeah, I
I'm not
mean,
sure.
just to do some very gross level pattern matching, it does say that the visions of his head were alternately of love and horror,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's like, well, is Stebbins love and the Major horror? I don't know.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know, because he seems to not really like Stebbins, and certainly, I wonder, like, he was one of the characters that had this like kind of glowing respect for the Major at the beginning of the walk, right? It's like
Uh-huh.
what I think one of the first things he says about him is, "My dad didn't like this guy, but he never saw him in person," right? And I wonder, like, obviously his opinions toward him have changed over the course of the book so far, but I wonder how much is which is love and which is horror, Stebbins or the Major.
Yeah, that's true. It could be either. I
Mm-hmm.
guess. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so we move on to chapter 12. This chapter begins at 9 a.m. the next morning. It is interesting, Matt, that King kind of just jumps over what is probably the most exhausting, terrifying, and horrible part of the walk so far, which is once again having to walk through the night. Like, I think if you recall, Garrity's first night was just awful for him, and the sunrise basically saved his life. But he just kind of fast forwards over this one here, and I kind of agree with the choice, though. I'm not sure what else you could say about the swirly haze of semi dreamlike walking that characters are going through throughout the night, so he just kind of fast forwards over that stuff.
Yeah, I think it would be a lot of meaningless hallucinations, basically. So yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
yeah, I agree. I mean, it is interesting. It feels like the only time that we've really explicitly skipped something, but I agree that it makes sense. I did want to take a second to mention something that you and I talked about a bit off air
Sure.
this week, which was like the paces that are usually set for races of this general nature, real world ultra marathons.
Mm-hmm.
Not that, so I don't think ultra marathons were a thing back when King wrote this book. Um, and
Probably
so,
not.
so I don't think he had any real world data on like how long is it reasonable for a person to walk at 4 miles an hour. But just for our information, like I picked one that I thought was interesting, which is the Moab 240, which is a 240-mile race through the desert of Moab, Utah. It happens to involve a almost 9,000 meter gain in elevation. So not only is it 240 miles, but you go up about 9 kilometers. And a winning pace for this race is about 58 hours. So if you divide 240 miles by 58 hours, you actually get a pace of 4.1 miles per hour. So the winners of this race, on average, actually do keep above that 4 mile an hour mark. Now, of course, they almost certainly aren't keeping that pace consistently. They're probably starting out much faster and then slowing way down.
Sure.
But I thought it was kind of fascinating how close that number is to the actual long walk pace, personally.
Yeah. No, and I think what.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I bring it up here because we're on hour 48-ish, and we're going to be moving into the duration of like the actual Moab 240 within this week's reading.
Yeah, it's absolutely wild to me that something exists where people voluntarily, without a gun behind their back, walk and exercise for as long as these kids have done so already.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I think one of the critiques I see most often levied at this story is that the pace King set in this book is not realistic and is probably way too fast for what something like this would ever be. And I get that. I think that's part of why I love it so much, though, because like it is an unrealistic pace to expect people to set for that long of a time. But that's part of the examination of like what pushes you or pulls you to do this thing to survive. Like how like a really fascinating examination of the survival instinct of human beings is how long can that motivate you. How like that it is kind of ridiculously fast, that it is a pace that only a professional athlete that trains for years and years and years to do these kind of ultra marathons can keep. How would one actually do that? So I don't know. I think you're right that he probably just picked a pace. Like it's a nice round number. It's 4 miles an hour, right? It's 15-minute miles. It's probably he went out on a walk one day and walked for 15 for a mile, and it was about 15 minutes, and it's like, oh yeah, that seems about right. But I don't know. I like
Yeah.
it.
Well, I feel like if he had said it as like a 20-minute mile or something, and then you went out and you did a 20-minute mile, there's a possibility that you'd be like, that wasn't so bad.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of irrationally think like, yeah, I could do that for another 300 miles.
Sure.
Whereas if you do just like 1 mile at that pace and you're like, oh shit, that was hard. And then you imagine doing it way longer, then you would immediately realize what a nightmare this would be.
Yeah, no, definitely. I wonder, like, because King obviously like is brilliant to walking. Like he walks every day, and he's been doing that for quite some time. But I don't know for sure if he was a big walker when he wrote this novel. So it's another one of those. I wish I got to ask questions of I wonder what present day King thinks about the pace that he had his character set in this book. Now that he's been a walker for quite a long time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I would be curious too.
Mm-hmm. So we did note that only two people died overnight here, which goes back to that cracker metaphor we were talking about earlier. That it seems like Parker's analogy was correct here. That the people that are left are some of the strongest ones, and they're not going to go down easy. So, despite the we know we're approaching the end of our page count, it feels like miles wise, this thing's got quite a long way to go.
Yes, it does. Yes, I agree.
So the conversation shifts over to our poor old stupid guy Scram, who we learn here most likely has pneumonia and is lagging fast. I really loved this quote here. They say he could have taken us all, I think, and he's married. What is his wife going to do? And Garrity's response is so simple but perfect. What can she do? Well, the answer is nothing. All these people are powerless in this.
Yeah, I love that.
Mm-hmm. So McVrees looks at the scenario and decides that the boys should make a pact, that whoever wins this thing, they all agree that person helps out Scram's widow in whatever way they deem necessary, financially, anything, just helps her out. Everyone basically agrees to this, and Garrity is kind of tasked with the going to some other people to get them to agree to it as well. He's told to go talk to both Barkovich and Stebbins to get them to agree. But before we talk about those conversations, Matt, what do you think of this idea that these boys are going to band together and be like, we got to help this person's spouse out?
Well, obviously it's a nice idea and everything, but like it's interesting how Scram's widow gets this special consideration when the families of the other 98 losers don't merit a second thought. So like it's not like I'm holding this against them. It's just interesting that they single out Scram's widow.
Yeah.
And I think it's for a reason, right? It's like it's because the idea of Scram having a wife holds this special fascination for the boys. It's something that they all wish they had. It's something that they think is incredibly impressive and so I think they probably all imagine if they had a wife they wouldn't have joined the walk, so it's I'm just I don't know, do you feel me at all there?
I do. I mean, I think it shows like to young people, like marriage holds this special fascination, right? That's like it's like this thing that everyone's probably going to eventually do, but is this all important signpost of moving into adulthood and responsibility and all these things. It's made out to be this big, huge thing, and I think their reaction to the idea that one of these people would be married reflects that. That why would you ever do this if you were married? Why would you ever do this if you had a kid? And frankly, like I had that same reaction too. You know, my reaction when you learned Scram not only is married but has a kid on his way. I think we talked about this in the episode. My reaction was, "What the fuck are you doing? Are you kidding me? You got a kid coming and a wife, and you're here? What are you doing?"
Yeah.
So I think a childish understanding of marriage. And kind of the pedestaling of the idea of marriage amongst a lot of people makes sense as a reflection of this.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah.
All right. So he goes to Barkovich first, and we finally get to find out what King thinks about people who play the game of life the Barkovich way, Matt, because Barkovich isn't doing really well at all. And Garrity finds him surprisingly willing to go along with Scram's wife plan. He says he always gets off on the wrong foot with people, and he did so again here. I like the idea of like using the phrase getting off on the wrong foot when everyone's feet are just like absolutely killing them at this point.
Yeah.
He also says that the incident with Rank wasn't really what it looked like, which Garrity's response to that is like, yeah, I was there, man. I remember it. It's not your version of events isn't quite what it was either. And then he says this to him. He says, I just wanted to tell you to make you see. I just wanted to tell you, make you see. A guy's got to have some friends. A guy's got to have a crowd, you know? Who wants to die hated? If you got to die. That's the way I look at it. So what do you think of the kind of the Barkovich turn here?
Yeah, I love it. Barkovich is the closest thing we have to a villain besides the Major. But he's also just a kid. You know, I love what this says regarding the walk being a metaphor for life too, because, you know, he made a bad choice. He now has had plenty of time to regret that choice. Maybe tried to tell himself a story about how that's not really how it happened, but I think he kind of knows that it was. Doesn't mean anybody will forgive him for it. And I love the idea, you know, speaking of choices being meaningful or meaningless, like he made a bad choice and now he's going to die knowing that everybody else that he's with, the people who sort of should have been his brethren, all hate him. That seems like it was a pretty meaningful choice in a bad way.
Yeah.
Being, you know, dying while knowing that you're hated is far worse than just dying. And he knows that.
Yeah, and I think it kind of goes back to maybe Garrity's you can't take it with you idea, right? Of this idea of this larger metaphor of life, of the people that fuck everyone else around them over in order to get ahead. And ultimately at the end of the day, we're all gonna die. And you might win, but will you? I think one of the things this says is that maybe gets you some short-term advantage. You knock someone else out, right? That he managed to knock a competitor out of the race, but in the long term, you're not going to win with that kind of attitude. And I think the book reflects this as a whole, right? Because if you look at Garrity himself, if Garrity goes on to win this thing, which we don't know if he does, we can guess maybe by the fact that he's the point of view character. But if Garrity goes on to win this thing, how many times has he been saved by Pete? How
Right.
like we had another instance of that happening in this week's reading. So it's been multiple times of the only reason you are still alive right now is because someone else was out there looking out for you. And it seems that this kind of attitude, this Barkovich kind of attitude, is certainly one that at least this novel thinks is not the winning strategy.
Yeah, I mean, makes sense to me.
Mm-hmm. I think it goes into our conversation before, but it's worth pointing out that Barkovich has a huge, exaggerated reaction to finding out that Scram is married. His response is to scream at him, "What did you think you were doing, numbnuts, playing gin rummy?" And I think this gets back to what we've already talked about with these kids' kind of fascination with the idea of someone in the group being married.
And it feels right to me that Barkovich would be the kind of guy who would be like angry that he would have thrown that away for you know, a very thin shot at something potentially better, right? It's like I think most of the kids are like, man, the only reason I'm here is because my life sucks. But it sounds like your life was great, actually. So that's really annoying, actually.
Yeah, I guess to Pete McVries especially, right? Like who's convinced that everyone's here because they want to die, and then he must look at a person like Scram and be like, man, you have a wife, you have a kid. Like what? Like in the old paradigm of the American dream, like the getting married and having kids is like a key part of that idea, right? You know, you get the good job, you get the nice house, you have a wife, you have a couple kids. Like this is the whole thing, and even if the reality for Scram is not that rosy, because we learn that it isn't. They're getting along okay financially, but they're not doing great, and he probably doesn't have enough money to send a kid to college. But just from the perspective of someone else, it's like, no, you have part of the goal already. Why would you toss all that away?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
So with that done, Garrity drops back carefully to chat with Stebbins, who is currently counting his toes. I love the detail of that. He walks up to him. He says, "What are you doing?" "Counting my toes." So Stebbins agrees to the proposal, kind of surprisingly, that he will also help out Scram's wife. He also mentions here, Matt, that this is probably the sort of thing that happens at every walk at about this time. That as the reality of the situation and as their mortality approaches them, all the walkers tend to come to this sort of agreement, pick one person, and agree to help out the people they leave behind. Do you think he's right?
Yeah, I mean, while I think we've pointed out that Stebbins is not infallible, I am inclined to just take his word for it, or at least suspect that he's directionally right. I think that probably once you reach this hardened core of survivors at around this point in the race, they're gonna take some kind of action of solidarity that looks something like this. At least in some cases, or even many cases, hard to say. Um, but I mean, it makes sense. It would take time for them to build this sort of camaraderie where they'd be willing to do this. Like I don't think they would have made this gesture the first day, you know.
Sure.
So,
And I think it again speaks to, you talked before about the surprising optimism of this book, and the fact that in this situation where everyone is kind of being pitted against each other, they seem to continue to work together. And we have another instance of that here, right, where they're not exactly working together, but they're also recognizing each other's humanity.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and helping someone out.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when it's like, you would be totally justified in saying like, no, screw you, I'm keeping all of my prize money, obviously. But it's like, well, that's not that's a very selfish attitude once you've really come to know these guys, you know.
Yeah. I guess the other question I have for you is, do you believe Stebbins, if that he wins, he will actually uphold that agreement?
Probably not. I mean,
interesting. See, I kind of do. I don't know. I think he sees it as no big deal. Like, I guess when you can have literally everything and anything you want, like helping one person out, not a huge deal.
That's true. I guess I don't have any reason to think that he would lie either. You know, in this moment, if he says he's going to do it, then he probably will. So that's fair. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I'd like to point out all our little bits and pieces and crumbs of world building, so I wanted to point this one out to you, Matt. Stebbins is talking, and he says, "In the old days, before the change and the squads, when there were still millionaires, they used to set up foundations and build libraries and all that good shit. Everyone wants a bulwark against mortality, Garrity." So that's just another little, not even like a fully painted picture, but just like one little brushstroke of what the world is, right? In the old days, before the change, not just change, but capital C change, when there were still millionaires.
Yeah, that's just one more thing that's different. Not going to explain why or how.
Nope. Have you had any change in your opinion that, like, we talked about this last week? Is King's choice to kind of not world build a mistake, or just like part of his kind of MO here? Have you had any change in your opinion on that, or you still think it's just kind of intentionally part of what we're doing here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it serves the purpose of making you kind of curious, but the fact is, it doesn't really matter, you know. Like, he could have a 5-page digression about exactly what happened and how and when and who, and it's like, oh, it has nothing to do with like the story we're telling. Like, the point is, it's pretty close to our world, but a lot more in the totalitarian direction, and you get that. Like, we all got that. That's the important thing. So um, I like it, actually. I mean, I'm a great one for thinking that sometimes people overdo their world building and just kind of wanting enough for it to be evocative and pull me in, and but like don't give me your world building documents. I don't want to see them.
Sure. So the other thing Stebbins mentions here, Matt, is that what he said about Olsen the other day was just BS. He was just joking. For a refresher, we're referring to when he was talking about the metaphor for exhaustion and how Olsen had gone so deep inside himself and found out some key secret about life and death. He says, I was just kidding. I was just pulling your leg about that whole thing. Olsen didn't know anything. And Garrity calls him out on this and says, no, you were being serious. He says, you want to cheat it. Maybe that's your trouble. You like to think the game is rigged, but maybe it's a straight game. That scare you, Stebbins? So what do you think about this, Matt? Do you think Stebbins is bullshitting here? Is this another, as we talked about, another chink in the armor of Stebbins' supreme confidence in his understanding of how this whole thing works?
No, I mean, I think you're right that he's either changed his mind or he is lying, because I think there is something that scared him. Where, I think if you look objectively at the choices that Olsen made, it's sort of like he was for a long time the perfect example of someone who was being driven by nothing other than the fear of death. He's just like an animal. He's just an animal being driven solely by the fear of death. And then it's like at a certain point, something clicks in his mind, and he makes this, like we talked about earlier, this almost like grandiose gesture, which is still futile in the sense of not making a difference, but meaningful in the sense of giving him an ability to go out on his own terms, you could say.
Yeah.
And that to him is almost like worth more than his life. Maybe literally, maybe not, let me say that out more clearly. The ability to go out on his own terms is worth more to him than his life. And I think that scares Stebbins because it makes Stebbins think, maybe I can't count on my own fear of death to keep me alive.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because, I mean, you could argue that even Olsen doesn't necessarily die of exhaustion, right?
Yeah.
Like he was kind of the poster child for Stebbins of the dying of exhaustion. That, like, I think he said specifically, eventually he's going to find that he no longer had the taste of carrots, and then he'd be truly exhausted, and then he'd go. But that isn't how Olsen goes. He doesn't collapse from exhaustion. He finds himself at the end there, and that's one thing. That's one thing Garrity says about him after Olsen died is he says to McVries, he says, he was dead, but goddamn it, before he went, he was alive. He lived. Like, that's something really important to him. And that is not the way Stebbins saw that going, I think. And that does shake him a little bit. And so it's almost as if, like, completely unprompted, he goes, hey, Garrity, you didn't really believe that whole thing I was saying about that thing that it turns out I was wrong about. Like, I was just pulling your leg about that whole thing. Yeah.
No, it's interesting because it seems very much like Olsen did not die of exhaustion, because he continued walking a substantial amount of time after being shot several times.
Yeah.
So he clearly had a lot left in the tank.
His intestines are hanging out of his stomach and he keeps walking. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, it wasn't a physical thing. It was a choice.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, this is the moment. I'm doing it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I think that's a theme for this week too, right? Because getting back to, what's happening here is Garrity returns to the group where Scram is waiting for him, and Scram thanks him. He thanks all the other boys for agreeing to this pact. We see here that his fever has broken, so he's better than he has been in a few days, but he's got pneumonia. He's screwed one way or another. And he also decides to go out on his own terms. He says, what's the point in waiting? I could continue to die of exhaustion, but instead I'm going to go out on my own terms. Again, something different, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's great.
Matt, this Scram's death really, really got to me. Like, really got to me. This part here where he says, I don't guess I'll be seeing you guys again. There was nothing in Scram's voice but simple dignity. Goodbye. And And like, I don't know, there's something like, a lot of these kids have died in this book so far, and some of them we knew quite well and felt bad for when they died, but this one really fucked me up.
I think it makes sense. It makes a difference that this is basically the only one that has calmly decided to sit down and just let it
Mm-hmm.
end.
Mm-hmm.
All the others have, yeah, they've fucked me up in different ways where it's been like, desperately screaming and begging to live, but
Yeah.
there's something, there's just, it hits a little bit differently. There's a different kind of poignancy for them to just be like, well, yeah, best to just do this on my own terms and just
Yeah.
accept it.
Yeah, and we see that House Graham does that as he walks up to Mike and Joe at the front of the Vanguard. He says that these guys are from his neck of the woods, so he chats with them. Then Mike and Scram about face flick off the half track and sit down for their final palaver. And I love, Matt, it says specifically that Gary comments on the oddity of this because they're both speaking different languages as they talk to each other at the end,
Yeah.
which I think is beautiful, actually, because it
Yeah.
shows that their ability to communicate and interact and form a bond and go out together was like irrelevant of language. It was something deeper and more, just primal
Yeah.
in humanity.
Yeah. The meaning of the act transcends the ability to know exactly what words you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's great.
And I mean, this is like we had earlier in the, not this chapter, I think it was in the last chapter, but they make this pitiful gesture, these raspberries that basically do nothing, have no effect, and seems pitiful. And then at the end of this one we have this other gesture that's made, a similar thing. Instead of just going to the half track, these guys flick it off, and it every one of the walkers like erupts in this raucous cheer for what they're doing here. And it is this really beautiful, important moment, where Scram took a death that was trivial and meaningless and brought meaning to it still, which goes back into everything we've been talking about here. That even if all that meaning is that the 40 remaining walkers felt a little bit more energy, felt a little bit more encouraged, felt they could go on a little bit longer, that does have meaning to it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's beautiful. I love it.
All right, chapter 13, our final chapter of the week. We jump ahead again. This time it's 2 p.m. on day 3. The chapter opens, Matt, on Baker and Abraham flipping coins and taking bets on who gets what. It's such a fascinating little scene because, once again, King manages to capture this totally, completely normal young adult male conversation and behavior in these kids, joshing around and flipping coins and making bets. And if you carved this section out of the novel and plopped it down in front of someone, like, they'd be shocked to learn that the context behind this is that these kids have been walking for over 48 hours nonstop without sleep. And if they slow down, they die. It's wonderful little opening of the chapter.
Oh, yeah, it's great. It's just totally normalized for them now. It's I agree. It's a great moment.
But then, I think intentionally slicing into this moment of normalcy, Garrity's leg suddenly cramps up, and he can no longer walk. These 4 pages, Matt, are some of the most wonderfully tense writing King has ever done, as Garrity sits down and desperately tries to massage the muscle back to loosen it. The seconds tick by, his warnings rack up. It's just incredibly tense, even though like, he's probably not going to die here. Like, if you used the rational side of your brain, you're like, we got a few more chapters left to go, it's probably not going to bite it here. It's still wonderfully tense.
Yeah. I mean, I admit there's not a lot of consolation from that, because you could always, like, it would be a masterful son of a bitch move to just be like, bam, Garrity, McVree's heard the shot from behind him and wondered who that was.
Yeah.
You could do that. There's no rule that says you can't do that.
Yeah.
Anyway, yes, incredibly intense. I agree. Like masterclass. Like, this is one of those moments that make me think, like, this is sort of a Stephen King starter book, actually, to get people hooked, because it showcases a lot of the stuff that he's particularly good at without without doing a lot of the without what you would consider more genre horror that he is known for.
Yeah.
And this scene in particular is a fantastic example of how much horror you can get out of a situation that is not, there's no zombie here, right? There's no werewolf.
Sure.
But
No,
it's a
I like
great.
that.
It's just fantastic. I love this so much.
Yeah, and the detail of it, right? Like as like everyone that's behind him slowly passes him by, and we get this all gone except one soldier, young and blonde and handsome in a remote sort of way. His silver chronometer was in one hand, his rifle in the other. No mercy in that face. Like, it's just the detail of it is just so wonderful.
Yeah, it's amazing, and like the way time stretches out and expands around this moment to focus on these microscopic details. It's great.
Yeah. Like, I'm going to read more of it because I just love it so much. Sounds thundered in on him. He had no idea if it was his imagination or heightened sensibility or simply the fact that of death reaching out for him. The safety catch snapped off with a sound like a breaking branch. The rush of indrawn air between his teeth was the sound of a wind tunnel. His heartbeat was a drum, and there was a high singing, not in his ears, but between them, spiraling up and up. And he was crazily sure that it was the actual sound of brainwaves. That's just awesome. I love that so much, and I'm not even sure why I love it so much, other than just like it's just so, I think, creatively wonderful to just say, okay, here's how I'm going to capture the intensity of the situation. Suddenly, someone's just going to turn the volume up on Garrity's world.
Uh-huh. I mean, it's funny because I've never really been in a immediate death situation like this, but it feels right. Like it feels like this is what it's got to be like. As it's like your soul clings to every sense around you, like trying to squeeze one last second out of life. It's great.
Yeah, I agree. Have you ever had a dream that like felt real enough to where you actually got the feeling of, oh God, I'm about to die? Because like I've only had a couple times in my life, and it's such a powerful experience that I remember it, that like I have a dream, and in my dream like someone pulls a gun on me, and I like it's real enough to where I feel the feeling of what it must be like in those moments of, oh God, like I'm about to get shot. And
yeah,
it's not it's not a great feeling.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think dreams are probably responsible for a lot of things that we don't give them credit for, because I've had literally it's funny to me you said somebody holding a gun on you, because my dream that jumps to my mind was being shot in the dream, and like running and like having the bullet wound, and like knowing that I was bleeding out, and that was that being my terror of death dream. So that's interesting.
Yeah, cool. I mean, I think we're lucky enough to where that experience only exists in our dreams, but it just I can't imagine what it must really feel like if the feeling I had in my dream was so acute and terrifying.
Yeah.
And I don't know if like this is kind of off topic, but like sometimes you have dreams and it's you're kind of reserved and not really emotionally invested in the things that are happening, and then sometimes for whatever reason it's all real and it's really happening to you, and like the emotions feel 100% real. It's weird how that works.
Yeah, I mean, I've had some dreams where some particular loved one, died or was dying, and that was like ruined my week. Like I had to call them. So that's absolutely a huge variety in terms of how these land.
It's so weird. Dreams are so crazy.
Yeah.
All right. Anyway, The Long Walk, that book we're talking about. With seconds to spare, Garrity gets up and takes off into a run. One of the things that I don't know if we've stated on the show yet, or at least clarified definitively, is that the warning time period is cumulative and doesn't reset until the warnings do. So basically, you have roughly 30 seconds between each warning, and then 30 seconds to death after the final one. And basically all this means is that by getting up with 2 seconds to go, Garrity is running on basically a 2-second buffer until he clears his first warning. So basically at this point we have one little slip up, one little, you drop down below 4 miles an hour for 2 seconds, and they're just going to shoot you. Like, there's going to be no warning, nothing. They will just open fire.
Yeah. It's interesting that despite how cold and merciless these soldiers are, they actually honor the clock to this degree. Like, that soldier there in that moment didn't just say like, 2 seconds, close enough, and just shoot him. They're actually painstakingly adhering to the rules. They're actually going to follow him for the several hours necessary.
Yeah.
Assiduously keeping track of that 2 seconds until the warning drops off.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the other side of the coin that makes these soldiers count off 3 warnings to a guy who's had his legs run over, right? They're going to honor the system no matter what, whether for good or for ill. And I think it goes to what you said earlier about the idea that the walk is itself completely above board, and that there is no, like, these soldiers are emotionless in every way, meaning they're not going to get pissed at the kids and shoot early. They're also not going to give them any breaks whatsoever.
The soldiers, to my recollection, have never said a single word other than
correct
warning.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's all they say.
Yeah. Exactly.
So sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with you. Yeah.
So in order to ensure that this doesn't happen, that he doesn't slip by and lose those 2 seconds, Garrity sets off to be to become the vanguard. He wants to walk fast enough to make sure he's always got a buffer. And his pal, Pete McVree, joins him once again. But we see here that Garrity is spiraling, is panicking. He's on the brink of death, and he knows it, and he's losing it. And once again, Matt, it's Pete McVree who saves our narrator's life. He distracts him by getting him to talk about when he was first accepted into the long walk, which actually serves as kind of dual purpose for us, because it finally gives us some information about how this whole thing works.
Yeah. This is the closest thing to that long-awaited info dump that we were sort of wondering if it would ever come. Although it is just an info dump about the long walk and not really about their society.
Sure.
I like the fact that Garrity refers to them as them plus, I think, Abe as the original 3 Musketeers. And I felt like it said something that McVree's just kind of takes that in stride and doesn't object to being called one of the 3 Musketeers. It's like he's accepted. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm just saying he's not even pretending like he's not going to keep doing this now. Like
right.
After the first time he saved him, he was like, "We're even. No more. I'm not going to help you again." He's not even pretending like that's not going to happen anymore.
Exactly.
So the story we're told here is an interesting one, Matt. We learn that there is both a physical and mental health exam that everyone entering must take. We're told that basically every kid above 12 years old takes this test. So every single person, in a way, enters themselves into the long walk. We learn, though, that only 1 in 50 manages to pass the things, and it seems like kind of a rite of passage in the society. Like, oh, you're honored if you pass it. Or you're honored if you go and sign up. No one is really worried yet because the odds of you passing it is like 1 in 50, and so like it's interesting the way in which everyone participates in this thing and is honored in this thing until the odds start to shrink down towards the inevitable.
Yeah. Now, of course, you always have the option to bail, right? That's the most fascinating part of the whole thing. Is it's like there is no inevitability. It's just continually fascinating to me how King is committed to making the walk fair, right? Because you could just opt out. Why not? Right?
Yeah. But I mean, this is the brilliant part about it for me is it has the illusion of fairness, actually, because one of the things that Garrity says here is when he got the letter that he had passed the aptitude test, I couldn't back down. There were too many people watching. I think it must work the same with just about everyone. It's one of the ways they tip the game, you know? So this idea that they don't have to force you to do this because society has been crafted around it to such an extent that you would be so socially ostracized by doing so that you feel like you cannot. So yes, you're absolutely right. There are multiple opportunities to back out. No one is forcing anyone to do anything, but it's a wonderful bit of psychological manipulation that gets these 100 kids here, I
Yeah.
think.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think this is what makes it so brilliant as a piece of social criticism, or you could even be interesting to consider The Long Walk as satire. Like, it's not funny at all,
Yeah.
but it is a sort of exaggeration of a thing to make a point. And the point here is like a totalitarian state can't really survive without the society doing stupid shit like this, where
Sure.
Bob down at the bakery is going to, shortchange you if you flake out on the long walk. And it's like, well, that's not the state. and the state isn't going to reward Bob the baker for doing that either.
Yeah.
It's entirely Bob. It's entirely the society. And that's a fascinating sort of criticism of human nature, and just an observation, I think a true observation about the way that these regimes persist through time.
Yeah, and the way in which the human brain like uses probability against itself. Like, one of the things I love about what we learn here is that, so you sign up for the test, thousands pass the test. Of the thousands that pass, 200 are chosen. We learn there are 100 prime walkers and then 100 backups. But the most interesting bit about this, Matt, is they call the 200 names at the same time, and they don't tell you which you are. They do not tell anyone whether they are a backup or whether they are a prime walker until after the final blackout date. So basically what happens is if your name gets drawn out of the hat and you take the back out, and we're a prime walker, then they'll pull someone from the alternates that didn't back out to go in your place. If you back out and you were an alternate, well, they don't have to do anything, but you don't know. And so it is this wonderful mind game of, well, I'm probably a backup, so I don't want to back up. I don't want to back out and get ostracized by my community. And like, statistically, I'm probably not going to be a prime walker anyway. Like, it's just every step along the way has this clear exit ramp, but also a clear like path to, I mean, it's like not that many people get picked, and
Yeah.
I mean, 50-50, like, I'm probably just an alternate. It's so devilishly crafted.
Yeah.
I love it so much.
Yeah. And even if I do have to go on the walk, I mean, I'm pretty good at walking.
Yeah.
No, I agree. It's all just hooking into your motivated reasoning and your socially motivated reasoning. I mean, it like, once again, like, everything about the walk on paper is hilariously fair. There's no impropriety. There's no overt manipulation. I think a lesser book would have made the walk overtly corrupt, right? It would have been underhanded in like obvious ways that were just perversions of like the process. But it's like, no, it's all just you making the choice.
Yeah.
It's your choice.
And then, the exact results of that is when people are yelling at the major, Raymond Garrity says, it's not his fault, it's your fault.
Yeah.
But of course it is his fault.
It is his fault. Yes. For setting up this system, knowing the way people are. Yes.
Yeah. For using people. And like, the response to when he says that is, well, he's the one killing me, isn't he? Is such a perfect response. Is like, I don't care if this was my choice or not. This man is going to send someone to shoot me if I slow down. So I'm going to blame him.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So Garrity recounts the stories of everyone trying to talk him out of this. First, we have Jan, who we learn agrees to sleep with him if he backs out, but he refuses, Matt. This guy who's seemingly obsessed with sex refuses that carrot. Then Dr. Patterson, his mom's current boy toy, tries to talk him out of it. He's unsuccessful, resorts to kind of rage to try to get him to influence him. Doesn't work. And finally he gets to his mom, who we learn like doesn't actually try to talk him out of it much. Garrity kind of assumes or thinks here that she was a little bit blinded by the prize. We also learn he had another brother who died. And so this is a woman who's experienced like so much loss in her life, her husband, her other son. And then, we have this son once again. So she's just kind of shell shocked by the whole thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think mostly she's just numbed by her life.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, traumatized. And
yeah.
I don't know. I honestly have a hard time holding it too much against her.
No. I mean, what God, imagine what you would do in that. And like her desperate cling to the idea that, the major, like if we, even after the blackout date, like if we talk to him, he'll let you get out of it. This is something that she echoed in the very first chapter, right? Like just talk to him and he'll let you out of this. And
Yeah.
Ray knows that's not the truth at all.
Right.
Yeah. But I do love the idea of like her reaction. Her reaction is the perfect distillation of the manipulation of this whole thing, is because when he first passed the test, she was proud, right? Oh, my son, like he did it. Oh, look at that. They had like a dinner for him in town and stuff. And then, then he's chosen. His name comes out of the hat. And it's like, oh, okay. But he's alternate probably. And then this, and it's like, well, I mean, we could probably get out of it if we just ask him nicely. It's just like, yeah, it's wild.
Yeah, it's a perfect case study of the process working as intended.
Mm-hmm. So before we move on from here, Matt, I did want to talk about the exposition presented here, because this is, I think, a pretty big exposition dump for us here. And I do think, and I want to get your opinion here, but I do think this is kind of one of the only parts of the novel so far where I really felt King's young age and inexperience as an author kind of show itself here. I think the exposition here is a little clunky. Like all the information we learn is great and I love it. And I'm like really into it. I'm really into Garrity's story and them discussing the details, but there is just a little bit of natural clunkiness to these two boys discussing things they both already know out loud clearly, like with the and you remember, of course, that the first blackout date is on this day, and we didn't know about, of course, as you know, we didn't know about whether we were alternate or prime until this date. Like, it just strikes to me as a little bit of clunkiness and exposition. I don't know if you agree.
I think in the moment, I don't think I was paying attention to that, but you're right that it's a bit too kind of clear cut and laid out there. I did feel like the notion that at this point in the race, these two boys would be kind of reflecting on how they got into this predicament, that if that felt right to me, but I think I agree with you in terms of the level of detail being too much.
Yeah, I mean, I have no problem with them kind of talking about how they got here at this point. I agree with that. I just do think there are bits and pieces where you can tell King is trying to get information to us and does it by having characters who both already know a thing say it out loud to each other for some reason. Look, exposition is like one of the hardest things to do in writing, right? Like good, interesting exposition is really, really, really hard. And we've talked before about situations and times in these books where King has just knocked it out of the park, where he relayed this information in a way that was like, holy shit, that's awesome. How you made exposition interesting. Bravo. This to me feels like just one of those moments of like, I need to convey this information to my readers. I don't know how else to do it other than have these characters read it. And it largely works, just a little clunky.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I will. It's not like I'm arguing. It's just like I don't know that I thought that at the moment of reading it, but sure, yeah. I think
Sure.
Objectively, you're right.
All right. So we also learned, Matt, speaking of misfortune, that 12 of the original Prime walkers used the April 31st blackout date, and poor Pete McVries was unlucky alternate number 12. So he as tapped to go into the walk. I love how when Garrity is like, how does this make you feel? You must be pretty mad about that. And he just shrugs as if to say, it's like, I mean, yeah, but what does it matter at this point?
Yeah.
I do think this is a fun little additional unspoken pressure point in this whole system, right? Like not only are you deluding yourself with the idea that, it probably won't be me. It probably won't be me. You also have the added pressure of knowing that if you back out at this point and are a prime walker, you have just killed someone else, right? Like
Right.
your action has murdered someone else. And
Yeah.
so that's part of the pressure that builds up to make it so not many people back out of this thing.
Exactly. I mean, they confidently only tap 100 backups, 100 walkers plus 100 backups, knowing they won't even need 100 backups.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you kind of wonder, like, of the 200 people, what if 150 people back out? You know, then they wouldn't have enough.
Yeah, but they designed their machine so perfectly.
Yeah. But yeah, they don't even need to worry about that, because it's, as far as we've been told, it's never happened. It's never happened that way.
Right.
So this distraction technique of Pete's works really well, and an hour later, Garrity drops the first of his warnings. He's got a little bit of buffer against death. And then the text here just gets really great. I this is a long passage, Matt, but I want to read it because I just want to point out how absolutely beautiful this writing is. They walked. The shadows got longer. Jackets appeared on the crowd as if a magician had conjured them out of a silk hat. Once Garrity caught a warm whiff of pipe smoke that brought back a hidden bittersweet memory of his father. A pet dog escaped from someone's grasp and ran out into the road, red plastic leash dragging, tongue lolling out pinkly, foam fleckling its jaws. It yipped, chased drunkenly after its stubborn tail, and was shot when it charged drunkenly into Pearson, who swore bitterly at the soldier who had shot it. The force of the heavy caliber bullet drove on the edge of the crowd, where it lay dull-eyed, panting, and shivering. No one seemed anxious to claim it. A small boy got past the police, wandered out into the left lane of the road, and stood there, weeping. A soldier advanced on him. A mother screamed shrilly from the crowd. For one horrified moment, Garrity thought the soldier was going to shoot the kid as the dog had been shot, but the soldier merely swept the little boy indifferently back into the crowd. So, I think this starts out kind of beautiful. Like they walked, the shadows got longer. Jackets appeared as if a magician summoned them. Warm pipe smoke is on the air, and then a pet dog is running around, and then shot, killed, calling out, sad boy. Is he like? It just, I think it paints a picture of this world, not in the details, but in the emotions. That this is the world these people live in. That a world that can be beautiful but can be horrifying at the same time.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, just the normalization of this sort of terror, right? I think it's been a while since I called it this, or at least I've been thinking about it this way, that like this is a sort of state-sponsored terrorism campaign against the populace, where you take 100 boys and you do this to them in public. It's interesting because the complexion of that has changed a bit as we've learned more about the nature of the race and realized that it's like volunteer and everything. But that doesn't really change the fact that it fundamentally is still a state-sponsored terrorism campaign designed to normalize this sort of violence against the people. And even something like shooting your dog is something that is done without any expectation that anybody's going to complain about that. It's I think it's interesting how, like, of course the little boy isn't shot. Does Garrity think they're savages? You can't do that, right? The little boy didn't sign the document that said that he was part of the long walk. The dog's gonna get shot. It's just a dog. But I don't know, I just thought it's like, yeah, there's still rules. There's still a society of law.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're going to make sure you understand where you stand in this hierarchy.
Yeah, and also I feel like if the boy had run up to one of the walkers, maybe he would have been shot too. The reason the dog was shot is because it was about to interfere with a walker. It was running up to Pearson.
Maybe so.
So yeah, maybe they left the boy alone because he's just sitting there crying over his poor dead dog. So they allowed him to live. But if he had attempted to interfere with any walker, then he wouldn't have.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
All right, so it's 6 p.m. now. Garrity is free of all his warnings and therefore thinking about the future again. He says, we're almost to Augusta, Maine, and after that, Freeport, where his mother and his girl wait for him. I love this part, Matt, because this has been a thing that the text has kind of subtly and repeatedly been reinforcing as they've gotten closer and closer to Freeport. Um, After he gets there, after he sees Jan, after he sees his mom, this thing that he's been looking forward to for hours and hours and hours, then what? What happens then? It just keep walking, I guess. Like, I have this thing, this you can call it a carrot that is pulling him along, that he's going to get to see Jan and talk to her briefly, but that particular carrot's about to go away really quickly, and what could be left after that?
Yeah, I mean, I think somewhere in here, Garrity even supposes what I previously guessed, which is that Jan maybe won't even be there.
Yeah.
And I suspect even if she is there, I kind of think it won't be like a positive experience for him, because he looks like hell. It's not like they're going to have a poignant reunion. It's going to be kind of messed up. It's probably going to hurt more than it helps, actually. So yeah, we'll see what happens then. It's almost like whether she's there or not, it's going to be bad for him.
Yeah, and I know. Like, it is really. I knew a person in marathon training who like really loved to break the race and the long runs down into segments just to give themselves something to look forward to for each bit. It's like, oh, we get to, like, if I get to 3 miles, then I get to have another one of my goo blocks, that, my energy blocks, and just to have some tangible thing to look forward to and to pull yourself towards. And that never really worked on me, because I would get to that moment and like, oh yes, I ate my goo block. Okay, that was 6 seconds. Now what?
Uh-huh.
It just never really worked on me. But this idea speaks to me of this growing fear that, oh my god, when this goes away, what am I going to have to walk for other than wanting to stay alive? And one of the things that the characters have been asking over and over again is wanting to stay alive enough to keep pushing you. And we'll see.
Yeah.
So as they rejoin the group, Abraham, who we're told is looking more and more like Mr. Abraham Lincoln with each passing day as his stubble continues to grow out, he tells us the story of how he was selected. He says, he took the exam on a spur of the moment just because he happened to have his work permit card on him at the time. Side note, another little bit of information about what this state is like, right? That
Right.
You need a card, you need a permit card in order to be able to work. Once again, slowly painting a picture of the world.
Yeah.
But we learn here that he had no idea what to write down in the essay, and he just kind of decided to take the piss out of them. He wrote, "I feel qualified to participate in the long walk because I am one useless SOB, and the world would be better off without me. Unless I happen to win and get rich, in which case I would buy a Van Gogh to put in every room of my mansion and order 60 high-class whores and not bother anyone." I thought about that for a minute and then put in parentheses, "I would give all my 60 high-class whores old age pensions too." And then he's shocked to find that he passes the assessment, that this essay is apparently deemed appropriate enough that he passes. And Matt, I guess my question for you is, speaking about how the walk is, as you said, on the surface all above board, fair, what wrinkle does this bring to that idea? Because I guess it asks the question, what are they looking for in these assessments?
Right. What are they selecting for exactly? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I would guess that the essay is used to sort of filter for the kids who are fit enough to perform well, and then also in some sense dumb enough to go through with it and not back out.
Mm-hmm.
Or instead of dumb enough, maybe you should say indoctrinated enough, or stubborn enough, or susceptible enough to peer pressure, or something like this. Because, the extremely low dropout rate can be partially attributed to having selected for the proper, subset of boys. Like the essay, the fitness test is testing like, okay, how are they going to do physically? The essay is testing like, are they going to go through with it? Because I don't think a truly random sample of 200 physically fit 16-year-olds is going to is going to only see 12 dropouts. Um, but I don't know. I don't know. I think it's probably more complicated than that, but I definitely think this is one place they're putting their thumb on the scale.
Yeah, I find this so interesting, and I'm trying to trying to do that thing where I remember, is this and I thought I had because of my own independent thinking, or because the book later talks about this specifically. I'll go ahead and do it, and then we'll find out one way or the other.
Okay.
I guess the interesting thing to me is they've created a system here in which every single young man basically signs up to give the government a detailed psychological, mental, and physical profile of them.
Uh-huh.
And then they have the ability to randomly select 100 of them to be killed.
Right.
It seems like it would be a very good idea to weed out any kind of people that you would find undesirable in your society.
Sure. Yes, this occurred to me as well, so don't feel bad about potentially spoiling. I just leaned away from it more over time because I was like, this isn't like a bag of 100 undesirables. Like a lot of these kids seemed like they would have been useful cogs in the machine, so I killed them.
Sure, fair.
But I did have the thought that you're describing at some point.
I also don't know if the audiobook allowed you to see that Abraham's essay is horribly misspelled.
Not direct. No, I mean he totally mangled the pronunciation of certain words in a way that made me suspect that that this was the joke. I did not get Van Gogh though. So. That's good.
For those that maybe haven't read the book in a while, it's spelled VAN space GO. Like a van, it goes. A van go.
Yeah.
It's great. Yeah, no, I mean, I ultimately we don't know, and I like what you said about the idea. Is obviously it's clear there are people in here. Like Garrity is such a great example of a perfect little boy of the state. But I mean, you could go that it's so insidious that they've developed metrics and abilities to tell like a latent attitudes and ideas that maybe wouldn't surface until later, had they been allowed to foster in these kids. I don't know.
Yeah,
just
possible.
A fun thought.
Yeah. Sure.
I agree with you. Like the insidiousness of the state so far hasn't seemed that direct. I mean, I guess we have the squads, and we know that they take away any person that speaks ill about the Long Walk publicly, which is a great way of keeping the thing going. Because how can you stop something if no one is ever allowed to talk about it? But
true.
But yeah, I mean the voluntary nature of the walk, the fact that it's mostly seems to be controlled through psychological and societal manipulation and not direct state intervention, does lend to the idea that they've just established this thing, and they set up this thing, and then they set up a rule that says you're not allowed to talk about it publicly bad, and then they just let everything else run its course, because they don't need to do anything else.
Yeah. I think that's it. I think you're right.
Yeah. All right. Well, that will reach the end of our chapter, as our characters kind of continue walking into the distance, wondering what's going to happen next. We're coming near the end here, Matt. As we said, we only have a few more chapters. I believe it's 4 more, 14, 15, 16, and I think 17 is the final chapter. I think it's like 60 pages, Matt, so we're getting there.
Yep. I'm sure we're due for a happy ending for all.
So as we said, we will be back in 2 weeks to talk about the final part of this book. Once again, apologies for not being here next week, but we will give you something to chew on. Matt, I think we've kind of elected, we talked about this before we started the show, but due to Matt's illness and the fact that he has to travel internationally tomorrow, we're going to go ahead and cut off the episode here and not read all your discussion questions. Please be sure that we both read them all when you posted them and enjoyed them quite a bit to last week's question, but we just don't have time to add that into this episode. Matt needs to get to bed.
Yeah. I mean, I think my voice is gone, honestly, at this point, but we appreciate the answers, of course, as always.
Yeah. But we will still have a discussion question for next week's episode, and I I thought that we'd have a little bit of a fun one here because I don't think next week's episode is going to be too fun on its own. But the question we have for you is: if you were in the long walk, what would your strategy for success be? How would you win the long walk if you were in it?
Yeah.
And you can if you want to just say I would die, fine, but still, what would you do? How would you make sure it takes as long as possible for that to happen?
Yeah, I think we've all thought about it a little bit, right?
Yeah. All right, folks, that is it for us here this week. As we said, we're off next week, but we will be back in 2 weeks to finish Richard Bachman's The Long Walk.
Yeah, remember you can reach us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at kingslingerspod or over on the subreddit at r/doofmedia.
And if you are not already subscribed to Kingslingers, come on, you got to do it. Come on. That's all I'm going to say. Just come on.
That's right.
Come on. Come on.
Likewise, if you want to support us, come on. Patreon.com/doofmedia.
There you go.
Speaking of which, we've got special thanks to new patrons Lori M, Ruth O, and Michael C.
Thank you so much, folks. We really appreciate that. There's tons of bonus stuff available now. I believe we've got a bonus episode of Other Levels of the Tower coming not next week, since Matt's going to be out of town, but the week after, where we're going to be talking about the newest adaptation of Children of the Corn. So that'll be coming in a couple weeks. So if you're a patron, you want to check that out. If you're not a patron, you want to go to Patreon, support us at that $10 level, and then you get that episode and a whole bunch more. It's so much. Am I selling it well? It's great. It's worth it, I think.
It is. It's like a whole nother one of this podcast that you're listening to.
Yeah, presumably you like this because you've gotten this far and you're still listening.
Yeah.
All right. But of course, we understand if you cannot afford to support us right now. You can help us out in tons of other ways. The biggest one being continue to leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts and other podcasting platforms. We have another new review this week. It comes from Roblet the Goblet, who I recognize as Rob the Gob from Discussion Questions, but good to see you. Good to see you on Apple Podcasts, Rob. Roblet the Goblet gives us 5 stars and says, I've had the pleasure of listening to this podcast since shortly after it released. Thanks to these well-spoken guys, I've experienced King books that I've read and haven't read in new and very informative way. The in-depth breakdowns of each chapter of each book is thorough and rich with insight. Now with the season 3 well underway, I'm revisiting nothing but books I've read before, and I'm so excited each Thursday when the new episodes drop so I can obtain another nugget of wisdom that gets doled out. Love this podcast so much, and I'm here for any amount of seasons they put on this show because it gives me another reason to reread all of these amazing books. Keep up the great work. Long days and pleasant nights. Well, thanks, Rob. Thanks so much. I love that he said we were well-spoken, and as I was reading him saying we were well-spoken, I stumbled over my words, which just goes to show how right he was.
It's about the fallibility of memory.
We appreciate that, Rob, and thank you to everyone who has and continues to leave those ratings and reviews. As we say every week, they really, really do help us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right, folks, so that's it. Wish Matt a safe flight as he flies out of the United States. I've already forgotten where you're going, Matt, but that doesn't matter. I hope you have a good time, and we will be back here in a couple weeks to finish up the long walk. Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.